Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around. It's late in the afternoon. I first want to start by acknowledging the session conveners. Really grateful to be here, and thanks for organizing such an interesting session. I'm excited to be here to present some of the work that we've been doing on flood risk in the Himalayan region. And this is part of a bigger study that we're trying to understand the relationships between flood generation processes, the types of infrastructure, land use, and climate change that are impacting flood generation, and mitigation strategies for trying to reduce flood risk. And this is one small piece of it. And the way I've decided to focus my 12 to 14 minutes today, now 12 and a half, is simply on the observations. And so we've been doing the same kinds of inundation mapping that we heard about in the first session. But something that's been really troubling me is the frequency and damages associated with these unpredictable events. And so what I'll be presenting today are some observations from the local gauging networks and talking about some of the challenges associated with the losses generated by those and how those are related to infrastructure, humans, and hydrology. So, and as I talk about this stuff today, I want to be sure to emphasize both elements of the flood risk equation. So we've been doing a really great job, primarily in the US, of focusing on reducing those likelihood of flood events, but we've really not done a very effective job at reducing exposure to floods and reducing those losses or damages from those. And that's one thing in my lab we're particularly interested in is thinking about the probability distributions of losses and how those, how we can try to address both sides of the equation. So I'll try to think, as I talk through this, emphasize how these different components are related to both sides of the equation. Okay, so I mentioned in the title there's these three things we're interested in. One is water infrastructure, and when we think about water infrastructure in the US, we typically think about large dams and their ability to reduce flood risk. But it's also the case in some instances that water infrastructure can increase flood risk, and there's one example that I will come back to in India, the Bhakra Dam, where it has been claimed or it's been attributed to actually contributing to flood risk in a basin, but I'll come back to the details about that. A second component of changing flood risk in the Himalayan region is changes in land use, and I'm going to try to use the laser pointer. There's a couple of ways that we know about land use impacting flood risk. So a primary way is that impacts the likelihood of flood events, and that's where we have transitions from forested areas to urban areas. But as you can see in this land use map of, this is the Sutlej River basin in India. The peach and orange colors are small shrubs, herbaceous, and bare rocks. So there's really not a lot of forested areas here. So that transition from forested to urban is really not a major issue here. What is a major issue from a land use perspective is the development in the floodplain. And so that's the other side of the flood risk equation. That's the exposure side. And that's actually happening pretty prevalently down here in the lower parts of the basin. That's what these bars represent. I'll come back to that too. But what you see is the green and the yellow, which represent agriculture and naturalized area. And I'll present some data on how floodplain development is changing in this area. And then finally, we have a warming atmosphere. This is also the Sutlej River basin, and just want to point out that in this basin, the snowmelt contributes around 70% of the annual discharge from the basin. So as you think about the impacts of a warming atmosphere in the order of 8 to 10 degrees in this basin, you can see that it can have potentially a large impact on the runoff and the flood regime. So these are among the reasons why floods continue to be among the most widespread and impactful of natural hazards. So this leads us to a statement of our study objectives, how do changes in infrastructure, land use, and climate contribute to the flood risk in the basin. But I'm really most particularly interested in these localized and unpredictable flood events. How are they generated, and what are the relationships to flood risk in the basin, and how do we mitigate them, which is related to the third objective. So what are our most effective management strategies at reducing those? And for folks who've worked in the Himalayan region before, this is probably old news to you, but there's a couple of really interesting things about working in this basin, or in this area. One, to me, is the types of flood hazards that are there. So they have sort of the standard vanilla types of floods associated with heavy precipitation and monsoons and glacial and snowmelt. Those are the more predictable types of events that occur in the basin. But what I'm really interested in, and which tend to be the most destructive types of events in the basin, are those associated with the landslide lake outburst floods, the LOFs, the GLOFs, the glacial lake outburst floods, and cloudbursts. And cloudbursts are interesting events. I have a student working on trying to forecast those. They're these, essentially, they're sort of like atmospheric rivers that we have on the west coast here. They're these cells of high moisture cells that occur, that move in upper river basin, and essentially they interact with the orography to drop a ton of moisture off in a short period of time. So the Indian Department of Hydrology Meteorology defines them as events that drop 100 millimeters or more in an hour. We've seen events that drop 500 millimeters in an hour. So these are really large events, and they are quite damaging, as I'll show you some results on shortly. So it's these unpredictable events that are quite interesting. And then what I call key information hazards after working in China for 10 years. It's really difficult to gauge these basins, right? They're high elevation, they're remote, they're really dynamic, really extreme weather conditions, so it's expensive to build them and to maintain them. So that's a key issue associated with just generating data. But then once the data is generated, it's difficult to manage and share it. So the Sutlej River Basin is one of the basins I'll be presenting. It drains data on it. It drains from the Tibetan Plateau in China through India down into Pakistan, right? And these countries really don't communicate with each other on much of anything. They certainly don't share a lot of hydrology data. So that's at an international scale, these transboundary rivers. But it also happens domestically in India, where we've been working, where different institutions have different objectives for the rivers, and thus sometimes are not open to sharing information with each other. So that results in limited access to data and oftentimes limited quality. Some of the data sets that I've been working with will get entire months of data where the discharge in the river is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And it's clear that nobody was out collecting data those days, since a lot of these data are manually collected. So another key information contributor to flood risk in the basin. So I'm going to be presenting data from two basins, and they have one big thing in common, which is the catchment size. They're both large, around 60,000 square kilometers. But there's a few key differences. The Sutlej River is in India, drains from Tibetan Plateau. This is the China side, this is the India side, and then Pakistan's over here. And it's actually a major tributary to the Indus. And the site that I'll be locating is here, or discussing, is located here at Rampur. It's located around 1,700 meters elevation. The other site I'll be talking about is the Kosi River Basin here. It's located primarily in Nepal, and I'm going to specifically be presenting data from the Dudhkosi, and it's the major tributary that drains Mount Everest. It's located around an elevation of 4,000 meters, the gauge is. And the thing to know about these other two things to know about these basins, the Sutlej is known now currently for the hydropower and water resources development in the basin, whereas Kosi has essentially none. But the Kosi is known for being the sorrow of Bihar, and Bihar is a state in India to which it drains. So lots of flooding, lots of really catastrophic flooding in that basin. Okay, so I'm going to quickly shift to results, and I'm going to talk about the Dudhkosi first because its story there is easier and quicker to tell. It's a 46-year data record, and again, I'm just focusing not on the modeling that we've been doing, just on the observations. And what we've seen in these data records, just even based on a simple linear regression, but from a couple of different analyses, is that there's an increasing trend in peak flow. And these are based on annual peak discharges. And this trend is consistent. If you go across, there's 4 tributaries here that are gauged, and they all have a strikingly similar slope to those linear regressions. So we have consistently similar increases in Mainstem flows. The other key thing is that there's a number of glacial lake outburst events that they're quite common in these basins. This one event right here from '98 was particularly destructive. There were 400 lives lost, 200,000 houses damaged, and 4 dams downstream that were damaged by this event. And these events are pretty consistent throughout this region. There have been 24 this is not our work, this is from folks at ECMOD, but there's been 24 glacial lake outburst flood events in the recent history, and these are exceptionally damaging, destructive events. And I think about that likelihood of events versus the consequences or the damages. Focusing on the likelihood of these events is quite a difficult task to track. This is just a real simple log Pearson type 3 analysis of flood frequencies, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's a short period of record, and I've diced it up in a number of different ways to try to make sure that these trends that we're seeing are consistent. But what I'm presenting here is splitting the record 24 years and 24 years. And what you see is it seems to occur somewhere around 1990 that there's a shift in the flood frequencies that are somewhere around 1 to 50 years appear to be increasing in magnitude. And this is consistent whether you split the record as 30 years, 24, 24, whatever, however you dice the data up. It appears to be this increasing in flood frequencies in the basin. And part of this might be explained by land cover changes. So what I've plotted essentially are just land cover changes. First, we mapped delineated the floodplains. So this is not a land use throughout the entire basin, it's just in the floodplains, because I'm interested in that exposure component of the flood risk equation. And so what you're seeing is that in the floodplain, what's changed is from 1970 down to 2007, in 40 years, we've lost 70% of the land use is shifting from glacier, from 70% to 0% glacier. And it's being replaced by spare herbaceous and bare rock by 2007. So we're seeing this shift, this loss of glaciers in the floodplain. This doesn't even, we haven't even, I'm not presenting the data for the whole basin. Another key point, and I want to keep emphasizing in the Kosi, is that there's not major dams, no kinds of diversions or impoundments of great magnitude. Okay, switching to the Sutlej, it's a slightly different story. Now we're moving down further in a different basin, further northwest, sorry. And there's a couple key things that are interesting about the Sutlej. The Sutlej is a great place to develop hydropower. It's narrow, steep canyons, which are really effective for building dams. And other folks have realized this, and there's now on the order of 10,000 megawatts of hydropower potential, not developed, but potential in the Himachal Pradesh state, which is where Sutlej is located. And there's some interesting conflicts here. As I mentioned, it drains from China. China doesn't share data with its downstream partners. So the reservoir operators at Bakra, which is this dam here, I showed it earlier, they never quite know how much water is stored in the snowpack in India. In China. So they're operating this dam, trying to provide irrigation water and hydropower without really knowing how much water they have. So there's this hedging that's constantly happening, and they generally keep the reservoir pretty full in terms of, because they need to secure that water supply to downstream. But sometimes it may come at the hazard of generating or contributing to floods downstream. So there have been a number of folks that have been arguing the dam should be reoperated because it's contributing to floods downstream. So this water infrastructure is a big part of the story there. This is a really short data record for reasons I won't go into too much detail now, but what you see from this basin, there's a lot of dams that are being developed most recently, but there's also a lot of similar to the other basin, to the Sutlej basin, sorry, Kosi basin. Now we have landslide lake outburst floods, and these are also highly destructive events. They're frequent in a short data record, and they're also highly destructive. So you've got around 150 lives lost in the 2000 event and around $200 million US of total losses in the basin, just from these individual events. Now, cloudburst events are a whole other sort of issue, and I do have a student working on forecasting these. They're quite difficult to track, but the thing to note about these things is that they're really also quite destructive, and they're quite regular or quite frequent, these high precipitation events. They're very localized, but can be quite destructive. One more thing about the Sutlej River Basin that I want to point out is that there has been a land use shift in the floodplain here as well, shifting from small shrubs in 1970 to rocky debris by 2007. And this has been apparently associated with grazing in the basin, which can impact floodplain roughness and thus flood attenuation. So just to summarize, out of time, higher elevation tributary basin appears to be more subject to things like glacial melt and gloughs and these shrinking glacial areas, whereas the Sutlej itself, the lower elevation basins appear to be more impacted by water infrastructure, these unpredictable landslide and cloudburst events, and land use changes. So this leads me to the conclusions, and this is the thing that we're really focused on and interested in studying, which is how we can quantify actually the benefits of non-structural flood management practices, those practices that reduce exposure to floods. Because for the more predictable events, like heavy precipitation, we can probably effectively manage those through dams and levees because they are probabilistically oriented. But for things like landslide, debris dam failures, and glacial lake outburst floods, things like early warning systems and relocation and evacuation plans are likely to be more effective because we can't currently predict them. So with that, I want to acknowledge my colleagues and take any questions that you guys have.
Thank you very much for the talk. We have time for a question. Manu.
Do you mean that 70% of the annual flow is due to snowmelt, or 30% of the annual flow is due to snowmelt? Because I think you got it.
In the Sutlej River Basin, Bookhagen's work has demonstrated this, that 67% of the annual hydrograph of the annual flow leaving the basin comes from snowmelt.
I think that's wrong.
That's what it was. Okay. That's what's reported in Bookhagen's, I think it's 2009 paper.
We have the data, so I think there is no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, it's almost exactly opposite.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you again.